Japan has been on top of the world of online RPGs, or MORPGs, the smaller but older brother to the MMORPG genre, for nearly 2 decades. Making their mark first with Phantasy Star Online back in 2000, followed by more franchises such as the Monster Hunter series in 2004, and the less online-centric versions that were inspired by these games, such as Dark Souls in 2011, and Dragon's Dogma the following year. All 3 series are still in circulation, with Monster Hunter to receive another title dubbed Wilds planned for February 25th, 2025. Showing the staying power of the formula, with even Phantasy Star still around and kicking after having a 10+ year run in Japan post-2012. And it shows how impressive Japan was on the international stage even. The West has tried a number of titles meant to emulate some of the success, though never quite striking the correct balance or finding the right formula to do so. Dauntless was a major attempt at this, likely the largest attempt we have seen, besides Guild Wars 1 back in the early 2000s. Dauntless was developed by Phoenix Labs, which was led by ex-Riot Games executives and featured some veteran developers from titles such as Mass Effect and Dragon Age. Dauntless would launch cross-platform with cross-progression with a staggered launch on all platforms, with its 1.0 launch being back in September of 2019. And the most recent Awakening launch on Steam being just this month as of the video, December 5th, 2024. While Dauntless was able to have some success, especially during the lull period of the next Monster Hunter game, the aforementioned recent launch has bombed, putting the title at one of the worst rated major titles at a 15% on Steam. While Dauntless was able to have some success, especially during the lull period, what was supposed to be designed as a Western alternative to Monster Hunter has now become a mere footnote in the titles who dare to challenge the behemoth story. Why? Why did Dauntless, which has had so much on paper about it going in the right direction, fail so epically when they attempted to launch on Steam? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will diagnose the largest contributing factors to the reasons for Dauntless failing to slay the behemoth in its genre, or at the very least, wound it. Pay attention as the timeline of events unfold, as clues will pop up on screen and allow you to use your detective intuition to solve the case. After the timeline terminates and enough clues have been gathered, we will reach the final deduction, every detective's favorite moment of ultimate wit where we crack the case for good. And then at the very end, a clue for the next episode. And so, why has the West consistently failed to emulate Japanese online RPGs or MORPGs? The story begins with the founding of Phoenix Labs back in 2014. The company, as reported by many different outlets, was founded by ex-League of Legends developers, though rarely is it actually mentioned that these were former executives and not the developers that people would necessarily remember or associate with having the direct impact on the game itself. This is relevant because executives, especially in the video game industry, rarely have hands-on video game development experience, and a producer or executive's job is different in corporate structure. Too long didn't read, or in this case listen, but Phoenix Labs was founded by some business guys from Riot Games, but in their defense, they did what you should do with money and a business idea. They hired people with expertise in the field, aka experienced video game developers, about 40 of them from major companies of around 110-person team. Well, sort of. Phoenix Labs was intending on creating an online RPG, and were making an age-old mistake in the modern age that still plagues us heavily today. They chose veteran developers without online RPG experience. The caveat was that the executives from Riot were claiming to have thousands of hours in the Monster Hunter series, which could, theoretically, circumvent this issue. Experienced gamers with chops for design or interest in such is kind of half or more of what has made the virtual world industry so impactful and special. Even some of the most famous developers, such as Jeff Kaplan, Yuji Naka, Brad McQuaid, Yoshi P, and even the Gower brothers were all turbo gamers' first pre-developer arc. But theoretically, the ducks were in a row, as we say in country culture. Dauntless, as the title would become known as, would be revealed by Phoenix Labs 2 years after their founding, December 1st, 2016. Dauntless was described as an online action RPG inspired by games like Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, and World of Warcraft, where players could either work together with friends or tackle the game solo. Note that this initial description seemed less MMO-like than the one that would come later. Jesse Houston, the company's CEO, would state that Dark Souls and WoW served as inspirations in the sense that Dark Souls showed them difficulty could be achieved in a product and succeed, and WoW for its social elements. Dauntless was trying to position itself as a free alternative to Monster Hunter while offering some cool Western aspects that some of the games could lack in the East. But the following summer at E3 of 2017, Monster Hunter World was already introduced, and apparently was in development secretly for 3 years. Now, there isn't enough evidence to state that the Dauntless team had enough information or was aware of this ahead of time, even if they had like a crazy market researcher, like me. I think it's very plausible this launch caught the team slightly off guard. When Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, the Monster Hunter 4 made for the West, came out in 2015. Sure, you know they're going to keep making Monster Hunter games, especially because things are going so well for them, but remember, partly the success of the Switch and the failure of the Vita led to the Monster Hunter series going to Switch and then going to PC. These are factors that Dauntless could have been aware of, but not exactly prevent, especially given the fact that Monster Hunter World was effectively what Dauntless was selling itself as. It was always online, had a serious focus on social mechanics compared to the previous MH games, and even allowed for up to 16 players to play it. This meant that now Dauntless was going to have to be that much more unique, and they were going to get graded on if they properly did their homework or not. Because just being the free-to-play alternative to a successful franchise isn't that good if nobody is playing your game and that particular opposite game is selling millions of copies with a box price. Dauntless would attempt crowdfunding of a sort with expensive $80 founder alphas released August 19th, 2017. Now, to be clear, I don't want to say that I'm defending this practice, but I'm only going to partially defend the part that this allows you to actually get some proper feedback because it controls who's actually buying the game, and those that buy the game are those that are actually going to give you feedback, and so on and so forth. But other than that, you are selling a free-to-play game for a crazy high price, which does nothing to build faith in your product. The issue I have with it is it's important to know how a company you are supporting garners funds, and Dauntless seemed to exhaust all resources to do that, which spoke to what kind of company they were to an extent, because knowing where the money comes from is important when making purchasing decisions. Closed beta would hit September 1st, 2017, inviting only a select few to slay the behemoths, or the bosses and monsters within. This beta would cost, at the very least, a $40 price tag to join in and test the game. Dauntless would have their first update, a regular winter event of sorts, Frostfall, December 18th, 2017. This update would add 2 new quests, 2 new behemoths, new rewards, and expanded character creator options. But I should make it a point to mention already that the art style in Dauntless was, I don't know how to be nice about it. It's like a mixture of SWTOR and Fortnite. It's like Fortnite the Old Republic. Or just something ugly. To be frank, I despise it, and most people weren't the nicest about the graphics in SWTOR either in the first place. The worst part is, opinions of the art aside, it feels utterly pointless to me, and a gross misunderstanding of the game that you're trying to mimic. Think about it for a second. SWTOR and WoW have stylized low-poly graphics because they're trying to appeal to more massive audiences on the PC, due to, at the time especially, how expensive PCs were. Both of these games over time shrunk their worlds, though SWTOR was the much faster of the two in that process. But simply put, having more simple graphics makes sense when you're trying to build a more simple game or have a more simple graphic style, which usually makes sense when you're building a MMO. But in this case, WoW is from 2004, so why did Dauntless look on par, or if not worse, than a game from 14 years previously? And why did it look like Fortnite? For appeal! For appeal, we should have a Fortnite art style. And that's what a business head would say that was clueless about video games. Let me elaborate. Monster Hunter World and Dark Souls. These are Japanese action RPGs, and Monster Hunter, a largely online one, much like its inspiration before it, Phantasy Star Online, also from Japan. Japan has a unique style of online RPG that kind of already includes action in it as a prerequisite, meaning they don't call their online titles action online RPGs, they just call them online RPGs or MORPGs. Japan is not interested in making massive titles, no, but they still can craft meticulous worlds that house their players or inhabitants in it. They are largely a cooperative-focused market. Because they're not worried about being massive, they're able to constantly innovate in terms of gameplay and graphics. Hint, 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 graphics. I mean, shit, look at the Monster Hunter games even on the 3DS. They look gorgeous, especially the trailers. Now compare this to Dauntless. Was Dauntless pushing the envelope graphically, or even artistically? Well, no, not even close. And what about gameplay-wise? That remained to be seen, but now there was a heavier weight being placed on that feature performing well, or better, when the game looked so forgettable and worse than a 3DS game. My issue with this especially is that it calls into question those thousands of hours reportedly spent studying or playing Monster Hunter as a series. Like, how did you guys not notice that nearly all Japanese ORPGs are mostly focused on presentation and gameplay? This is part of what makes the game so engaging. especially as the scale of the Monster Hunter series just grows more and more. People are waiting to see what boundaries are going to be pushed by them, especially with their increasing interest in online. Monster Hunter World would launch January 26, 2018 and would change the world, and that's not a pun nor an understatement. It sold a massive 20 million units pre-expansion, with another 7 million in addition post-Iceborne expansion. Monster Hunter World was everything that PSO achieved with PSO 2, and then more for the franchise, really pushing the envelope forward for all ORPGs in Japan, and even other virtual worlds globally. Dauntless would enter open beta May 24th, 2018, allowing the game to be actually played for free for the first time, and I feel like this is a mistake. I mean shit, even Guild Wars 2 had free weekend tests during its hype cycle for players who didn't even pre-order the game. Sure, they were limited, but I think that it speaks to the difference of building a community versus a customer base. But to be fair, Phoenix Labs technically didn't have a publisher. They actually had investment or venture capital funding, like in October of 2018, where Phoenix Lab would secure Series C funding that's often reserved to already successful companies, I might add, from a venture capital fund. They would also receive a number of more fundings throughout the process. But let's talk about Series C. Series C funds are on a lot more of a shorter ticking time bomb and would contribute, I think, later to the issues for the company. For me, more importantly, it shows that Phoenix Labs was interested in selling their product as fast as possible versus developing it. I'll elaborate. Yes, they need money, and more of it, to develop their game and go big, but if they were already achieving things like Series C funding, then the company was already successful. This is a classic example of a company wanting to skip the natural growth process in favor of going bigger and having a faster payout. But there was still a chance to sell what was purchased by the VC company to get control back, at the very least, right? As you can see on the Crunchbase website though, Phoenix Labs had a history of raising venture capital funding. And with that, Dauntless was going to have high expectations placed on it, VC level expectations, even higher than the one that the pedigree of the team brought with it. But money is needed to fund a game and project, and while it's easier to spend someone else's money, venture capitalists always get their pound of flesh, one way or another. Dauntless would be announced to be cross-platform, which would actually make it unique compared to Monster Hunter World, which was much needed. Cross-platform and cross-progression, with a PS4, Xbox, Switch, and even mobile launch planned. Still described as an online ARPG, and after Dauntless had been playable for around a year at this point, with fairly little to no content available in it, I might add, it would finally enter early access launch on consoles May 21st, 2019. And this goes back to my monetization problem. You guys have venture capital funding, and you're still doing paid early access? You're paying major developers to work on your game, why not just spend some more months working on creating a finished product? Well, besides just money being the easiest and truest answer of all, it could be also due to them feeling the pressure of Monster Hunter World, and the pressure that it would continue to place on them. Because while Dauntless had reached an impressive 3 million players at early access launch and then 6 million a week after, Monster Hunter World was selling more than triple that with a full box price attached to it. This meant that Monster Hunter didn't need to make post-game revenue as typical with most Japanese games. That was just a cherry on top. While Dauntless, on the other hand, needed a large enough population and time to make enough money to be even remotely competitive. But being the little brother can pay well, but only if the bigger brother doesn't just crush you, or if you don't have venture capital funding riding on your little brother success. In a bizarre turn of events, Phoenix Labs, speaking from their marketing lead to be fair, would state that Monster Hunter World was actually helping their player base, but then the argument is kind of a technical one. They say that it hurt the live population, literally, but that it increased the market cap size, which would actually in time bring more players. But here's the thing, these aren't the same audiences. Oh, shocker. No way. But you've stripped much away of what makes Monster Hunter special and what makes Monster Hunter in the first place, and you don't really offer anything different or unique enough besides being free to play and having cross-progression and cross-play. It frankly feels delusional to say this, and the delusion makes me think that they weren't taking their ass-whipping seriously, which is important when you're trying to grow. I mean, you couldn't even really monster hunt in Dauntless. All of the mechanics around the monster hunting weren't even in the game. I mean, even Witcher has stuff like that. But anyway, it just feels frankly delusional to say this, and I think that that delusion makes me think that they weren't taking their ass whipping seriously, which is important in growth. GameSpot would review the game during this period, as they should, as early access launches shouldn't be treated with kids' gloves. Not when you're already monetized and have a venture capital funding backing you. And they would rate the game a 7 out of 10. In their review of Dauntless, they would state that the cross-platform mechanics were nice and seamless and had a good variety of weapons, and they liked how accessible the game was. But they disliked the hub world and NPCs not being fleshed out, a lack of a concrete narrative cycle, and the bugs that the game was still suffering from. IGN gave Dauntless, frankly speaking, a pretty glowing review. IGN found the game insanely fun and accessible as well, but they actually would laud the fact that Dauntless had removed many of the complexities that the MH franchise was known for, though they found the game lacking outside of its combat. Duh. Let's talk about these reviews a little bit. 7 out of 10 is pretty good for Dauntless, I would say, especially when GameSpot stated that the game lacked engaging monsters and engaging monster hunting, and the graphical style was overall lacking. These are huge negatives for anyone trying to play a monster hunter game, let alone an ORPG. And yet they still rated the game a 7 out of 10. IGN, on the other hand, gave Dauntless an 8.5 out of 10. But what was the most bewildering was that they were actually calling the art style striking. I mean, what? Based on what? The maps are lifeless, the monsters literally look the same even when different variants, save for just a few color differences. Here's a literal example. Take a Basaria for Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, or multiple other games. It has 3 variants, but the variants are not just visually different, they actually have different properties to them, including how they act. Now check out the variants in Dauntless. For example, the normal Gnasher versus the Ragetail Gnasher. They are literally just color palettes different. It's like somebody put it in Photoshop and just hit a button. That's it. I could do that. And it wouldn't really be worthy of a full wage or career, and it certainly wouldn't convince the player base of anything. But it's not just the fact that the variants look the same, it's because the monsters in Dauntless barely feel like monsters, or behemoths as they're called. You don't actually hunt them, for starters, like in Monster Hunter or even in the Witcher series. Throw in the fact that the art styles and monsters themselves aren't very scary or engaged in the world or engaging, and they feel just less impactful. But wait, there's more. The hitboxes in Monster Hunter are dynamic, and each boss has as many as like 7 hitboxes. Contrast this to Dauntless, which has always had issues with its hit registration, even in the modern times, and Dauntless just feels less polished, and not just like a free-to-play version of Monster Hunter, but like the Fortnite Kids Glove version that nobody really asked for, especially not those who played the inspiration titles in the first place, which all featured heavy world themes, impressive graphics, and a massive focus on groundbreaking gameplay. Dauntless felt less inspired by these titles and more like a Kids Bop version of them. Another major update would be released for Dauntless July 9th, 2019, dubbed the Fortune and Glory update. This would introduce new pirate themes and Trials, which were the challenging variant of Behemoth hunts. Trials would feature the same behemoths, but more evolved and more challenging. This is pretty standard fare for the industry, but I'm not really a fan. I feel like developers use this as an excuse to not have to teach their player base before the endgame, and even then, until they reach more challenging content. Difficulty or lack of it is going to be an issue, and it was an issue in Dauntless, so the Trials were kind of like the best response to that given the time and an industry standard. Dauntless would finally have its 1.0 full launch 2 years after it was playable, September 26th, 2019, on PC, PS4, and Xbox One. The 1.0 patch would put Dauntless into its best position yet, but the issue that I and many others have with it is that now that the game is actually considered finished, it feels a little too late, right? I mean, Monster Hunter World was already kicking, and has been kicking for some. But the benefit of free-to-play means a bigger audience, or at least initially, as retaining them is kind of something else altogether. But Dauntless would reach an impressive 15 million players total. The thing is how many of these players were still playing the game, and how long were any of them even playing for? The Switch launch was slightly delayed from the rest of the launches, though it would come alongside a major update for Dauntless, dubbed Escalation. Escalations are introduced, which are a new type of hunt that you could defeat 4 bosses sequentially, offering more of a challenge. Effectively, though, another repurposing of the same content. The issue being, in this case, every time a new hunt isn't introduced that actually involves the game, or brings it closer to modern times, the game feels more and more outdated. I mean, escalations are just, again, repurposing of the same stats with added randomness, and the community reacted in kindly, which was not very favorably. Still, Dauntless had managed to launch on all platforms except mobile, as promised. Now think about that. That mobile launch might seem like it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't even be mentioned. But if they built the game with that in mind in the first place, like Albion Online, it's very likely that the low-level graphics could reflect that decision, which means that not doing it now made a lot of that decision kind of pointless. But that's just my 2 cents. Phoenix Labs, in an attempt to shed their venture capital funding, or more like outrun it, would sell to popular SEE gaming publisher Garena, January 29th, 2020. According to CEO Jesse Houston, who would be staying with the company, this would allow them to be bankrolled by Garena while still working on their goal of making Dauntless into the best free-to-play MMO in the history of video games. This sounds comic book level corny for starters, and second, suddenly the game becomes an MMO when it's going international? Why? Nothing about the game's infrastructure or scale had changed, and Monster Hunter World or Japanese ORPGs don't call themselves MMORPGs either. While being confident in your product and future is totally normal, this seemed a bit delusional given the state of things. The Call of the Void update would introduce the Void variant of the Behemoths, and for the first time introduce a expanding live narrative that would be attempted. This felt like a little bit too late for me though. I mean, the game had already been playable for 3 years and in the oven for longer than that. Where was the original world? Why wasn't it there originally? And why was it just now being included and being expanded more? That's where the lack of world in Dauntless just rears its ugly head again and again. It's not just the reskinned monsters or kid-like visuals that ruin the threat and feel of the world, it's also the fact that the world itself, literally, like things like the hub city, is fairly lifeless. This is bizarre to me because it manages to feel more lifeless in PSO or even PSU and subsequent titles from the early 2000s. That's where I call into question again the market research that was done on the product. Why not utilize the strengths of the Western market, aka making the world feel more livable? It's like the only thing Western about Dauntless is the fact that it has Fortnite visuals and a drive towards profit. Dauntless would unveil a massive free expansion that IGN, a constant glazer of Dauntless I should add, would regard as a near sequel. Reforged at the very least was a revamp of the Slayer progression system, making it more like a traditional skill system. And before, the zones that you would fight in just felt like as lifeless as the hub city did. With this update, they would actually have some sort of life to them. The last and final major change of the update was that Dauntless was moving from a singular mission-based hunt system to a multiple mission-based queue system, which was more MMO-like. Real quick though, the reason I'm not surprised that some outlets were glazing Dauntless is these outlets are notorious for hating MMOs and not even understanding them. They even dislike some online RPGs because of their difficulty and styles. So Dauntless removes the parts that people complain about, but is it actually for the better? The Ostergaard Justice update would happen August 27th, 2021, and introduce a new island dubbed the Blazeworks, which would feature more powerful behemoths. There's a problem though. As the game slowly expands, and I mean slowly given how fast its competitors were expanding, is that the general gameplay loop and concept of the game, of this add a new zone with a few threats in it and little interactivity with throughout, at least in the case of Dauntless, just wasn't very good. Multiple reviewers even talk about this. They even remark that, hey, the gameplay loop is similar to something like Monster Hunter, but it's just not very good. Later the same year, Dauntless would launch on the next generation of consoles, the PS5 and the Xbox Series X console. Phoenix Labs would go independent February 3rd, 2023, freeing themselves from Garena. The founders themselves would buy themselves out of the Garena deal, and now operate independently. And while this could be framed in a good way and kind of like the rebellious way and like, yeah, and sticking it to the man or whatever, it could also be framed as these companies don't believe in PL or their product anymore. Fae Farm is also mentioned at this time, which was just announced and showcased the previous year. This was a new title for Phoenix Labs, a farming simulator-like game. Fae Farm would launch later in the year and fare pretty well as a cooperative farming simulator. The graphics also seemed to match the message and theme of the game, which was something that Dauntless was lacking in heavily. I mean, you can even see it in the Dauntless trailers. It looks like the whole meme of everyone wearing random colored clothing that they just got from their drawer, or they just woke up in a rush, but worse, because some of these colors are like neon bright. It's like if you got into the swimming trunks drawer. The art direction and presentation in Dauntless is just bad, but Fae Farm, a newer, more childlike game, put that on display even further. Fae Farm also showed that Dauntless wasn't the only focus for Phoenix Labs anymore. In the summer of May of 2023, Phoenix Labs would reportedly suffer a layoff amounting to 9% of their staff. More importantly, especially for the future of Dauntless, would be the news that quietly behind the scenes, Phoenix Labs would be acquired yet again, this time by a blockchain company dubbed Forte. This is like a venture capital company on evil monkey steroids. If Dauntless would sell its VC chains due to the upcoming culling, imagine the expectations placed on them from a blockchain company and how much money would be expected to be made. December 2023 would come, and the company would suffer yet more layoffs. Phoenix Labs was hurting, and Monster Hunter World beating up their spin-off title and, well, having bad expectations was likely the largest contributors. This was leading to a loss of their best talent. In fact, by the beginning of 2024, Dauntless had lost the majority of its original development team, and if you don't believe me, just go check out LinkedIn and reference the names from the credits. some of the main developers would join another Vancouver-based team dubbed Critical Path Games, and others would join other studios such as Torn Banner, Nintendo, and more. It's hard to keep talent on your team, because they often care more than just about money. They often care about making an impact, having a vision, and being respected, and Dauntless was seemingly moving towards anything but that. Phoenix Labs would suffer yet more layoffs, this time a massive 150-person layoff amidst a restructuring. This sounds like to me that Forte did some math, and figured they weren't going to make a return on their investment with the size of the team that they had. Now, this makes them seem like a cartoon villain, but to be fair, Phoenix Labs already likely wasn't moving very well business-wise, hence the need for such a drastic culling, and the need for the purchasing in the first place. While this might seem like a move to maintenance mode already, I actually have seen it historically be a bit of a 1-2 punch maneuver, where a major layoff might happen, followed by a major update meant to kind of save the game. And that's very much what Dauntless Awakening, a major update signifying a major Steam launch, was supposed to be. But just about everything went wrong. At first glance, the update seems great. Expanded weapons, some new changes for a seemingly stagnant game, but upon launching on Steam, Dauntless Awakening would be rated one of the worst rated titles in the series at 15%. The update would limit your weapon options down to a mere 2 to 3 types per the 7 types in the game originally. This would cut the weapons down from like 70 to just like 20 now. And sure, the weapons were more unique, but now they're placed behind the battle pass, even more so limiting your options on top of rug pulling you as a previous player. This is like Overwatch 2 level stuff. The old progression system was gutted in favor of the new Reforge and Prestige system, and worse, many people's progression, already completed, was removed. And if you're waiting for the part that I tell you that the update was good and I'm just misrepresenting it, it's not coming. You can go read the update yourself. It really felt like a last-ditch effort, not to save the game, but to make as much money as possible with the least amount of outrage generated. Worse, it seems like an update not really even made for the current fanbase, or the previous one, but made in an attempt to convince new players to join the game with common systems that those players would be familiar with. Phoenix Labs would respond to the massive flop and criticism with, well, nothing really. At first especially, they would follow that response up with a partial response, but the reason I'm being so critical of this response is that they were just giving you points and currency after the fact, by the way, to try and make you happy for the fact that they gutted and removed so much from the game. Worse, the response showed no actual desire to shift course, and no respect past oops for their audience, which made the future of Dauntless seem all too set in stone. And if this seems like I'm being a bit too futuristic in my declarations, look at the Steam charts. Starting at 3,200 players peak, and then within 1 week, just 344 players left. This is for a free-to-play game. Then you take a look at Dauntless during the holidays, during Christmas time even, a high for many multiplayer games, and the peak player base has dropped below 200 players. The Awakening, this update, was supposed to be the resurrector for the game, or at the very least an update that could bring new players into the game to inject some new life into it so they could make money. But instead, a blockchain company secretly purchasing Phoenix Labs had tried to pull a fast one, and the player base here was all the wiser and said, no thanks. God, do I love market competition and capitalism. The music is playing Detectives, and boy is it catchy, am I right? That means a case, this case, has come to an end. Dauntless meant to signify fearlessness and determination, and Dauntless has certainly been determined. But to what end? I'm featuring it in the Death of Game series because it already was a floundering title as soon as Monster Hunter World was announced, and then launched. And this recent Steam launch has not only killed the population, it's killed the perception and community surrounding the game. You can already see it in the reviews on Steam, with many people calling out Forte in particular, not willing to trust the game or company any further because of the acquisition. And so, why did Dauntless fail so harshly? It's become one of the worst rated titles in the series. It was like Monster Hunter Kids Bop, a game in the market that was poorly researched. Fan base treated like a customer base. Lackluster visual style and presentation. Poor business decisions. It fails to innovate or differentiate enough from its inspiration. Oh, and that last point, let me elaborate before departing, Detectives. We talk about the death of comparison a lot in this series. Fitting, eh? But in the case of Dauntless, it's even more jarring, because it showcases something that I've mentioned earlier in the video, sure, but another thing that Phoenix Labs has added themselves to the list of. And that's Western titles misunderstanding Japanese titles. The Western market has just seemed to misunderstand what makes certain Japanese titles so successful. You see it with Monster Hunter likes, Final Fantasy likes, and much more. And you saw it in this case with Dauntless and the Monster Hunter franchise in particular. The reason this is so interesting to me is that the most famous online Japanese titles are actually based on Western titles. PSO was based on Diablo, and Final Fantasy XIV ARR is based on WoW. That's because the Japanese market is not historically famous for being an online one, especially internationally, though that has been shifting more in the latter years. Without having to put much more words into use to explain it, just watch these trailers and gameplay clips. Doesn't Monster Hunter World look insane? Just kidding, that's Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on the Nintendo 3DS handheld, and it looks every bit more impressive and epic than the PC Dauntless that would launch years later. This brings us to modern times. Monster Hunter Wilds, which looks like a borderline MMO in terms of its visual scale, and look. I don't even have to say anything. Look at how epic this trailer is and even the gameplay that's included in it. It's like watching a damn movie. A movie that you have to hunt these movie-like monsters in, all the while trying to survive their ferocious onslaughts. All of that danger, intrigue, and spectacle in the world and the monsters themselves wasn't there with Dauntless. And that's why Dauntless won't likely last very long, and the Monster Hunter franchise with titles like Wilds will only continue to bear more fruit. Thanks for watching.
Only the appearance of a stranger saved Cesaria from impending destruction.